I think that is more, in a way, conservative than taking a player like Morgan, who can maybe provide you that one special miracle moment, but isn't going to be consistently fit and ready to play in all of these different games. That is, I think, a concession to the realities of the Olympic tournament. All right, welcome to a very special edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Wednesday, June 26th. You know, we had to do it because it is U.S. Women's National Team roster release day. We have a roster for the Olympics for the U.S. Women's National Team. I think it's a day that is both very exciting and I think one that perhaps people dread because, as we know, we're going to see some dreams coming true, and we're also going to see some very, very difficult cuts because this is not a large roster. It is an 18-player roster with a number of alternates who are not on the team but will travel with the team. There was one very big cut made, and we will talk about that in just a second. But before we do that, let's dive into the list of players who will be going to the Paris Olympics on behalf of the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team. You want to start designating that now because we're about to cover a lot of different sports this summer. So for goalkeepers, we have Casey Murphy and Alyssa Nair. For defenders, Tierna Davidson, Emily Fox, Naomi Girma, Casey Kruger, Jenna Neiswanger, and Emily Sonnet. For midfielders, Corbin Albert, Sam Coffey, Lindsay Horan, Rose Lavelle, and Katarina Macario. For forwards, Crystal Dunn, Trinity Rodman, Jaden Shaw, Sophia Smith, and Mallory Swanson. And the alternates will be Jane Campbell, Hal Hirschfeld, Croy Bethune, and Lynn Williams. So this is probably the headline of the day. It's going to be the title of this video. We all know it truly is the biggest piece of news coming out of this roster, which is that it does not feature longtime U.S. Women's National Team veteran Alex Morgan. Now, I think as this happens with a fan base like with the U.S., because one of the great things about the U.S. Women's National Team is that the fan base is very keyed in. So a lot of times there's like the question beyond the question, which you go from the initial reaction of like, wow, that's a big move to, is this a surprise, right? And I think maybe depending on who you ask, the answer might be different. I am actually on the side of surprise. I do think this is a surprise, not necessarily because of the larger existential questions of when it is time to move on from an older striker, but more just the context of how much Alex Morgan had been in the team in 2024. People might recall that Mia Fischel tore her ACL early in the year. They bring Alex Morgan in. We saw this actually kind of play out very similarly prior to the 2023 World Cup, where it seemed like Vlatko Andonovski maybe had Katarina Macario replacing Morgan in sort of that false nine role. Macario tears her ACL. Morgan goes back in with the team and doesn't lose that spot. So Morgan plays in the 2023 World Cup in part because of a lack of availability from Katarina Macario. So here we are, fast forward to 2024. Macario is now in the midfielder pool, though we know she can play a false nine. Mia Fischel is maybe the original plan for that other quote unquote central attacker with Sophia Smith, which in and of itself is kind of a change from her being seen more as a winger for the U.S. under Andonovski. Mia Fischel goes down. Morgan comes in. Morgan does not produce at the international level the way that she used to, but kind of shows all of those intangibles in the Gold Cup and in the She Believes Cup of just what she brings as a leader to the team, how she can galvanize the team through tricky circumstances, her ability to do hold-up play, all of these different things. You think maybe, okay, once again, the circumstances have come together to allow Alex Morgan to be on this team, and it kind of makes sense, right? A new manager comes in. She gives this role to Alex Morgan to be a leader, to maybe come off of the bench, and then Morgan can ride off into the sunset after 2024. Hayes decided to be a little bit more bold, and I think that's interesting in two ways. One being that I do think that it does leave the team a little bit thin at the center forward position, though there are a number of players here who are very versatile and can move in and out. And we've actually seen Hayes in sort of a very small sample size, want more of a free flowing, there's overlapping runs. There's the ability to play a number of different positions. We know that Hayes likes that. So that's a surprise number one. And then just surprise number two is, again, there is sort of a lack of Olympic experience on the team, or at least a lack of Olympic success experience on this team. So it did surprise me. I think it's fair. Now, I will say, again, big picture, existential, I don't think you can ever be surprised when an older forward is left off of a roster. In some ways, it feels like a bold move for Hayes, but in some ways I wonder if it isn't sometimes the safer move to move on to the next generation, and then you kind of hedge expectations for results. You take Alex Morgan on this team, right? And you don't do particularly well, which I would say my particular standard for the U.S. is how they did in the last Olympics, right? So you don't do better than bronze, let's say. And this is going to be a very, very difficult tournament. So no expectation of them doing better than bronze here. You take a player like Alex Morgan. That is a lot easier to be widely criticized. That was actually one of the wide criticisms of Vlatko Andonovski in 2023, was this feeling that he wasn't willing to move on from certain veterans while also not setting the team up for like immediate success in win now mode. Hayes, if she doesn't take Alex Morgan, if she kind of cuts that now and says, this is going to be a learning experience and about building principles with these young players as much as it is about succeeding on the world stage, you don't do as well as 2020, it doesn't feel quite the same way. I think my main overall take on this roster is I kind of think this is sort of what Andonovski should have done last year. That result, I don't think there was any getting away from they're the two-time World Cup champions. There are going to be high expectations on that team last year, but there were roster decisions that could have been made, whether it was going young, which he did not always do. He did take some inexperienced NWSL veterans, but he did not necessarily go young. And he also, held on to a player like Megan Rapinoe. He did make the cut of Becky Sauerbrunn due to fitness, but he holds on to Morgan. Like, he holds on to some of these veteran players with the idea that that's the thing that's going to get you over the line. They have a disappointing World Cup, and they're kind of kept with this feeling of, okay, so what was the point? Why did we pad the roster with these older players? Hayes does the opposite. And she actually really emphasized that in her press conference today. She said multiple times that she felt like one of the things she walked into when she took this roster over, and she said 8 months, so she is talking about the Twyla Kilgore interim period as well. So when she was influencing roster decisions, at least, even if she was not literally with the team, is that she felt like there was a serious experience deficit that the team was now going through after that disappointing World Cup. And I think that's why you saw younger players get played into the Gold Cup. That's why you saw younger players get played into She Believes. I think I've said on this podcast that I think Gold Cup has been incredibly beneficial to the United States to have those players feel like they at least have gone through an international tournament, if not considered a quote unquote major international tournament. And she feels like through that process of getting those players ready, getting those players a lot of minutes, they can carry that into a, like I said, I am saying learning experience Olympics. She has not said that, but she has also been very clear that winning gold is not the only, I guess, task she has been given with this group. Will it work? Is there going to be a moment when they need those intangibles, when they need that cold presence up top who can, be a sharpshooter, who can hold the team up? I mean, we've talked about multiple times about how sometimes Alex Morgan's secret weapon is how she draws defenders in. She draws fouls. She can hit penalty kicks. Maybe so. But I also think maybe one of the lessons of the World Cup, I mean, I certainly have never placed too much on Megan Rapinoe missing that penalty kick in the round of 16 in 2023, but it does just go to show that like the best laid plans, even of your veterans, doesn't always mean what you want it to mean. So I understand it. Like I said, I think in some ways it's actually a safer choice to cut someone like Morgan now than to wait until after the World Cup. But I think it's a sound choice. Again, looking at the players that you have on the roster. So talking about the big omission, again, I do think that it is rightfully the headline. I do think that it is a contextual surprise, even based on 2024. I do not necessarily think it was the wrong choice. Don't think it would have been the wrong choice to leave her on, because I think if people remember, if you've watched this or watched, I think this version of the show, when we did this on YouTube back in June, this is very, very close to the roster that I predicted, or at least that I thought Hayes was going to go with. I think some of those internal logic points have proven to be true, which is that she highly prized the players who were in that June camp with her, that were onboarded at the same time as her. I think you can even see that in the alternates choice. She takes Hirschfeld and Bethune, who were in that group, and again, onboarded by her as a manager. I think that was highly prized. I think Williams making it onto that alternate list despite not being in that camp is actually a great testament to her ability, kind of as bittersweet, I'm sure, as that honor feels. So that played through. My roster did not have Albert, and it did have Morgan. My logic for that was I felt like Albert was not considered a real starter proposition, that she was kind of there to play understudy to the midfield roles, and that I did not think that there were, or I did actually think that there were enough other players who can play those midfield roles that are maybe listed as defenders like Emily Sonnet, or listed as forwards like, for example, Jaden Shaw, that you did not need to bring an understudy midfielder when you could take a player. I actually thought it was going to be Corbin Albert versus Casey Kruger, who did also make the roster, and that's a huge dub for me and the Casey Kruger heads out there. We're very happy for Casey Kruger. I think she's fantastic and very consistent. But it turned out to be, in my opinion, again, sort of that numbers game of they wanted to take a certain amount of midfielders due to fitness. Now, Albert, I still have just not seen praise for Albert internally from Hayes or from her teammates, other than she's very versatile. She works very hard. She has a very good motor. She can play in a lot of different games. Actually, fun fact, Albert has played in more U.S. Women's National Team games than Jenna Neiswanger has, despite probably having a smaller impact due to coming off of the bench. She is, I think, a concession player to the rigors of an Olympic schedule, which, again, talk about kind of the secret conservative elements of this roster. It seems so bold, but to me, I go, yeah, you're bringing the player who can play cover for your midfield that maybe can't play, like go through the entire group stage or play all these different games in a row because she's got this great motor and she's versatile, but she is not the star. And I think when you look at the rest of this team, you're seeing a lot of players who are consistent kind of stars in these roles. She kind of sticks out as someone who, like I said, is sort of that understudy, that cover. I think that is more, in a way, conservative than taking a player like Morgan, who can maybe provide you that one special miracle moment, but isn't going to be consistently fit and ready to play in all of these different games. That is, I think, a concession to the realities of the Olympic tournament, and one that the U.S. is willing to make that concession, make that decision to do so. So I think, to my point, having kind of made the predictions that I made, I think a lot of my thoughts still stand from the last time that we did this, which is that I kind of thought, like I said, it's going to be a team that Hayes feels comfortable with because she's been in camp with them. It's going to be a team that she thinks can make it through specifically an Olympic tournament, which really stretches the concept of what a starter is, really stretches the concept of what positional play is. You have to have a team full of players that can slot into different roles when asked, and a lot of players who can play at least 60 minutes in a variety of really grueling matches, which is going to mean a lot of rotation. But I want to celebrate some stuff here. I think there's a lot of really exciting things, and I think actually I feel like some of these wins, these quote unquote wins, are kind of underrated because of how quick the cycle moves, and especially going from Andonovski to Hayes, for example, this is going to be Sophia Smith's, Trinity Rodman's, Jaden Shaw's, Sam Coffey, Emily Fox, Naomi Girma. This is going to be a lot of young players' first Olympics. And the fact that those players feel so played in over the last 3 years of the U.S. Women's National Team, I think, is a huge positive. You don't think of Sophia Smith at this point as an inexperienced United States forward, but she was not even in the picture 4 years ago for the Olympics. Trinity Rodman, you think of a player who is a stalwart starter for her club and increasingly for the United States. She was not even really starting for the U.S. until the very end of 2022, very beginning of 2023. A player that actually played a lot more in the World Cup than I think she was even expecting. Jaden Shaw was not even on the world. Well, she was maybe hopefully on the World Cup roster, like radar, but not on that team. That is a player that has come on strong after last year's World Cup. There has been a lot of opportunity through actual sporting merit to make it onto this team. And I think for fans of the team that have wanted a different approach, I think that this is both a good testament to how maybe even that system that Andonovski was running that didn't work did hopefully develop some of these players to be ready for this, but also just you're having a manager that is empowered to make some of those similar decisions. I like that. I think, again, it sets things up so even if the United States does not win this tournament, they're going to feel like they learned something and they can build off of these games. What this means for how the team's going to play, I think, again, with Albert coming in, that does indicate I do think they're going to favor at times that double pivot midfield. I think Coffey, as we've discussed probably on the podcast before, is a fantastic distributive defensive midfielder. Sometimes she struggles a little bit more with the pace of and footwork and placement of defensive transition. She does play better with someone beside her. I think they've decided that's going to be Haran or Albert. Obviously, we've seen Andy Sullivan kind of drop off of the player pool picture. I've always said I'm kind of interested by that. But again, moving on is moving on. And I do understand Hayes kind of taking a strong line there. You see someone like Shaw playing on the forward line. As we know, she can play winger, but she can also drop back into the midfield. Macario likewise can play more of a forward role, even if she does start, quote unquote, in the midfield. Smith, I think, is at this point, if you look at this roster, that is the starting center forward for the United States women's national team, Sophia Smith. And I'm sure the hope there, we saw her struggle a little bit in the World Cup, maybe feel kind of like she didn't know exactly where she fit in with the passing lanes and with the runs she was supposed to be making. It's possible that Hayes feels like that vote of confidence in a player like Smith is only going to elevate what she's able to do at the international level. We've seen her play very, very well with Rodman and Swanson next to her. We've seen her play well with Shaw. Shaw does lose a player that she knows very well in Morgan, and not having Morgan there, I'm interested to see how Shaw does. I think she'll do perfectly fine, but just sort of keep continuing to build that chemistry with players that she doesn't know as well from the club level. I think, again, you look at maybe defensive possibilities. We saw Kilgore really rely on that Sonnet midfield option, especially post World Cup. It does seem like that is not really what they're envisioning for the Olympic roster. I think they like, again, Girma and Davidson as the starters. They like Sonnet as someone who can slot in because, like I said, those players are not going to be able to start every single game. I'm curious if we ever do see like a Sonnet Coffee midfield or a Sonnet Albert midfield. I think they have better cover in the outside back roles than they did even at the World Cup, with more players available with that mix of Fox, Kruger, and Neiswanger. I really do like this defensive mix. I think we saw them kind of play sort of that swing kind of pivot 4-back, 3-back style that I think a lot of these players are very good at. Kruger is going to be more of your stay-home defender. You're going to definitely have Neiswanger be sort of your push-forward defender. I think what they like about Fox is that she can do both. They have that kind of ease of left and right back options that when every point they were bringing Crystal Dunn in as a defender, they did not have. But speaking of Crystal Dunn, that is a player that you bring that can play on all three lines. So I actually really like this roster, I think, is what it's coming down to. I think when we talk about experience and like Olympic experience, we talked about this actually a little bit with the basketball team too, because I think there is a good larger question of what is Olympic experience? Is Olympic experience winning a gold medal? Well, you'd have to go all the way back to 2012 for that. And that would be your player like Alex Morgan, right? Is the experience a quote unquote normal Olympics? You'd have to go back to 2016, right? Any of these players that maybe their first Olympic experience was in Tokyo does not actually have probably what you would call a normal Olympic experience, as everyone knows that was an Olympics that operated under like total bubble lockdown, right? Is the idea major tournament experience? There are a lot of players who have played in World Cups on this roster. Is the idea, you kind of pull it together. Is the idea having international tournament experience? A lot of these players played in the Gold Cup. So I do think actually, if we're looking at, I always felt like we were going to be looking back on this period of Kilgore into Hayes, culminating in this first roster that was always going to be, as always with the United States, a very tricky mix of how do you build, how do you change, because change was clearly needed after 2023. But how do you also win? How do you win games? I don't necessarily mean the whole tournament, but I think if you're listening to this, if you're a U.S. Women's National Team fan, you kind of have to think to yourself, what is a successful Olympics to this team? Is it winning the group, making it to the medal round? Is it second in the group, making it to the medal round? Is it winning the group, but maybe losing a hard-fought game in one of the later rounds, and it's all right if they lose in the quarterfinals because they developed and they showed what they could do? Is it just about a feeling? Do you want the team just to sort of feel different, play different? Is it about feeling like maybe even if they came against teams that were better than them, they got the personnel right? I think everyone kind of has to figure out exactly for themselves what that looks like. And I think for Hayes, who I'm going to be honest, hasn't been incredibly clear about style or what she's looking for exactly. I think she's really been relying a lot on talk about culture and about sort of changing the mentality and learnings and all of that stuff in her short time with the team. But based on this roster, I think Hayes prizes talent, obviously, versatility, I think she praises players that she thinks are going to be very good Emma Hayes players. I don't think there has been too much taken in any point of what a player has done necessarily one coach or two coach or three coaches ago, which I think is very, very fair for a high profile new coach coming into the group. I think she is prioritizing youth. I think she is prioritizing the future. And I think that this is going to be as much about developing tape and playing like she thinks the U.S. women's national team can play than results. But as we know, easier said than done. I don't know exactly how you watch a team and feel really good about it and they struggle to win, right? But this is also going to be a very, very difficult Olympics. People might know, again, now that we have this roster set, eyes move on to their group, right? Group stage. They play Zambia, they play Germany, and they play Australia. Those are three very good teams. Winning the group is not guaranteed. They do have a good chance of obviously making it out of the group because many third place teams do. So you have to do pretty poorly in the group to be completely knocked out. But I'm excited to see it. They have some send-off games that this group is going to be playing. They will have a number of training players in with them. I think they're trying to keep, again, all of that development, all of that roster really healthy. One player that will not be participating in the send-off games is Lily Johannes. She is not a training player for those send-off games. And Hayes did talk about her and her availability as well. People know Johannes is the aspiring dual national who will probably be able to play for either the United States or the Netherlands. Being named to this roster would put her on the path to be cap tied to the United States by the end of the summer. Hayes, when asked, it was not entirely clear, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but the way she talked about Johannes, it did feel like it was still sort of that twofold thing of decision between coach and decision between player, where coach, I think, probably did not think that she needed to bring the 16-year-old midfielder just yet. I think she also, to a certain extent, did not want to lock Johannes into this decision just yet about what she wants to do with her future. But she did feel confident that she'd be able to work with Johannes after the Olympics, and I think that that's a positive. You have to, it will be really interesting to see if that patience is rewarded, or if Johannes is going to slip through the cracks for the United States, maybe because of a lack of commitment. Now, I love Johannes as a player. I would love to see more of her with the United States. I do also just think it would be tough sledding to have her on this roster and in this group. So how do you keep her close without monopolizing her time, as we know the United States women's national team can do for players, and without kind of bringing her in to fill out numbers without necessarily letting her have the space to make that decision that she's going to have to ultimately make. So the Olympic journey begins for the soccer team, for the United Women's National Team. And yeah, I'm excited to see it. I felt pretty good about where the team has been moving, the trajectory since about, May and June. But these are some players who still have a lot of developing to do together. And I think there are still some gaps, and we'll get into that once we kind of watch these send-off games. So excited about this roster, excited for the Olympics. It's going to be a tough tournament. I would advise everybody to find some other teams in addition to the United States that they want to follow and they want to watch, because there's going to be a lot of really, really good football that even the United States does not participate in. And we will just have to see what happens in the future. So thank you all for hanging out with me as we react to the U.S. Women's National Team Olympic roster. There'll be much more where that comes from in the future. This has been a special edition of The Late Sub. We will have more U.S. analysis likely next week with a little bit of NWSL, a little bit of WNBA. If you want to get your news and analysis fix, check us out on all audio channels, as well as subscribe to the Just Women's Sports YouTube channel. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. I have been your host, Claire Watkins, and we will see you next time.